So for Chapter 4 lab list, there are 3 different classifications underneath connective tissue. So connective tissue can either be classified as connective tissue proper, or it can be classified as fluid connective tissue or supporting connective tissue. And under those, you have to be able to identify subcategories. So we're going to start with connective tissue proper. Okay, connective tissue proper. And I'm just going to go over the lab. So this picture up here is something I'm going to talk about in lecture. There are, this is one of the connective tissue proper tissues. It has many cells, different types of cells, and different types of protein fibers. So we're going to talk about that in lecture. But what you have to know for lab is that there are, in connective tissue proper, we either have loose connective tissue proper or we have dense connective tissue proper. Okay? Loose just means that there's a lot of material, which we call the matrix, surrounding the cells. So here we see this picture here. This is adipose tissue. Adipose tissue has these big yellow fat cells, which are called adipocytes. Okay, all of these things here are adipocytes, right? And they're very distinct looking cells. They're very specialized cells. They store triglycerides. They store energy for your cells. So where do we find fat cells? Well, we find fat right underneath the skin. So here you can see the adipose tissue underneath the skin. We find it in other areas. We find it in the sides, your buttocks. In females, we find it around the breast area. It pads the eyes. It pads the kidneys. You know, you find it around the heart. You find it in many places. And so the picture that you recognize is this is the skin, and it's right underneath the skin, and that's the adipose tissue, and it's loose because you see there's a lot of material in between the cells. They're loosely packed. So this is connective tissue proper. It's loose connective tissue, and specifically, it's adipose tissue. So in the lab exam, I want you to put the most specific term that it is. So you would put adipose tissue. Then we have dense. And dense connective tissue is where the cells and the fibers are tightly packed together. It's still connective tissue proper, but it's dense. The tissue and the fibers are closely packed together. And the one that you need to know is dense irregular connective tissue, which is this one right here, right here. So first of all, we look to see, well, where is it at? And this again is the skin, so it's going to be found like right above the adipose tissue. That's where we're going to find it, in the skin, right above the adipose tissue. And when we look at the picture, we can see that all of these fibers and these cells, they're close together. They're tightly packed together. So it's dense, and it's irregular because if we look at the direction they're going, some of them are going this way, some of them are going this way, some of them are coming straight out at you. So they're all in many different directions. So what it allows is that skin to be stretched in many different directions. Okay? So that's dense irregular connective tissue. So you have to know dense irregular, and you have to know adipose tissue as far as connective tissue proper. Then we have fluid connective tissue. This is fluid connective tissue. It seems funny that we would say that blood is a connective tissue, but it does. These fluid connective tissues, there's several of them we're going to talk about in lecture. You only need to know the blood. That's it. So on the exam, you would put blood down. You don't have to put fluid connective tissue. But that's fluid connective tissue is another category. We had connective tissue proper, and then we had fluid. We know this is blood because you can see the different blood cells. There's the red blood cells. These are all, so these are the red blood cells. These are all the white blood cells, and these are platelets. Those are all things that can be found in your blood. There's other fluid connective tissues which we're going to talk about, like the interstitial fluid and lymph, but we'll look at that in lecture. Then we have another one, another category of tissue, which is called cartilage. Cartilage, and there's 3 different types of cartilage that you have to identify on the lab exam. So the first thing when we're looking at cartilage, this is a hyaline cartilage, and we're going to go through all 3 of them, hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage. We'll start by looking at cartilage. Now the thing with cartilage is the cells have a very distinct look to them, right? They are very distinct. They stain, when you stain them, they stain with a very dark purple cell membrane. And then the nucleus is stained very darkly. So we've got a dark cell nucleus, and we have a dark cell membrane. And so they all end up looking like these eyeballs. To me, these cells look like eyeballs. Sometimes the cells are packed together in groups, and sometimes they are all by themselves, and sometimes they're only with one other cell. But the cell itself has a very distinct look when it's stained. We call those cells chondrocytes. So anytime you see the word chondro or C-H-O-N-D, it's always talking about cartilage. So chondrocytes are those distinct looking cells that you find in cartilage. This is hyaline cartilage. The big clue here is that there's 2 clues that will tell you that this is hyaline cartilage. The first is the location. Hyaline cartilage is the most common cartilage in your body, and it's found on the ends of your long bones. So when your doctor says you have no cartilage left, he's talking about that hyaline cartilage at the end of your long bone, right? It's been worn down. Too much wear and tear from sports, from age, from whatever. It's worn down, it's gone. That's what he's talking about, right? All right, so that's hyaline cartilage. The second thing is that if we look at in between these cells, and I said in between the cells is called the matrix. When we look in between the cells, it looks very consistent. You don't see any fibers. None of the fibers stain, so there are no fibers. There are fibers in the matrix, but you can't see them because they don't stain. So it just looks like a solid purple. So that tells you that that is hyaline cartilage, right? The next one is elastic cartilage. Big clue here is elastic is in the ear. So that's the cartilage in your ear that you get pierced, right? So you get that pierced. So we know that that is cartilage because, again, we look at those cells and we see that the cell membrane has been stained really dark. The nucleus has been stained really dark. It looks like an eyeball. So that's cartilage. Those are chondrocytes. But now in between, we see all of these strands of elastic fibers. Plus we look and see where it's located, and that tells us that that is elastic cartilage. So you would identify that picture as elastic cartilage. The last type of cartilage that we have is fibrous cartilage. Fibrous. So we look to see the location. This is your spine, and this blue thing in between is the intervertebral disc. So that's a disc. When you've heard of a herniated disc, that's what herniates. Okay? And the outside of that intervertebral disc is covered by this fibrous cartilage. Again, we look at the cell. It looks like an eyeball. Well, let's go back. This is the cell right here. It's in what we call a lacunae. So this is its little cave out here. But this is the chondrocyte right there, right? And it is blue. Now the cytoplasm's blue, but nonetheless, it is it has a darkly stained cell membrane, and it has a darkly stained nucleus, so it's just a blue eye. Looks like a blue eyeball, right? And what distinguishes the fibrous from the elastic cartilage is the elastic cartilage had elastic fibers that were going in every direction. In this fibrous cartilage, all the fibers are going in one direction. So there will be a layer of that. And then the layer inside it, just inside it, those fibers will all be going in the opposite direction. And then the layer inside that, those fibers will be going in the opposite direction again. And they just keep layering, and they form this lattice work that make the disc pretty sturdy. The intervertebral discs pretty sturdy so that they don't herniate, so that the inside of the disc doesn't start bulging out through the fibrous cartilage. Okay, so you have to know all three of those: hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, fibrocartilage. Maybe you have to come up with some silly ways to learn these. I don't know, but you have to memorize the picture. Okay? Then we have bone. This is what bone looks like. So the cells in the bone, you can see them. They also are in these little caves, but here's a cell, here's a cell, here's a cell. All of these cells are called osteocytes. And the picture we have here that we're showing you that you have to identify on the lab exam, this is compact bone. And all you would have to say is bone, okay, just bone. But you can see that all these cells are arranged in a circle. They all go around in a circle, and at the center of the circle are these blood vessels. So that picture is bone. All right, so bone is another type of supporting connective tissue. So we had the three classifications of connective tissue. We had the connective tissue proper, we had the fluid connective tissue, and then we had supporting connective tissue. And in supporting connective tissue, we had both cartilage and bone. Right? So you have to know those. All right, then we're going to go on to the third type of tissue. Remember, we had epithelial, connective, and now the third type of tissue is called muscle. And so there's three different types of muscle. We have skeletal muscle, which you see on the top, cardiac muscle, and then smooth muscle. The only one that you have, oh, and you have to know all three for the lab exam. So the top one here, this one is skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle attaches to bone so that it can move your bone. That's what skeletal muscle do. So skeletal muscle sounds like skeleton. It's attached to your skeleton. So this picture here gives a big clue as to, okay, that must be skeletal muscle, right? Then if we look at the picture itself, at the diagram of the tissue of the cells, this is one cell right here. Okay, that's a cell. We can see that it's striped. The other thing we can see is that it has multiple nuclei. There's more than one nuclei in the cell. So that's another clue that that's skeletal muscle. This picture of where it's at in the body will be on the diagram for your lab. The next type of muscle tissue is cardiac muscle tissue. Cardiac muscle tissue is only found in the heart. The other thing is that when we look at the cells, we see that the cells branch. So yeah, they look a little like the cardiac tissue cells, but these cells, they branch. You can see them branching. They branch here, they branch here. You can see where they're branching. That's what cardiac muscle cells do. In addition to that, they also are striped, so they do look like skeletal muscle in that way. But the picture here of the heart is a big clue. That's cardiac muscle tissue. Then finally, we have the last one, which is smooth muscle tissue. Smooth muscles, again, they're going to be found in blood vessels, So now blood vessels have two different types of tissues. It's lined on the inside by the epithelium, and then right outside of that is going to be this smooth muscle. Because when the smooth muscle contracts, it can make those blood vessels constrict, and now you have vasoconstriction where the diameter narrows. So the big clue that we see, we'll talk about this more in lecture, but the big clue that we see is these are real short little cells. They only have one nucleus, and they're not striped. So you can identify it by the, actual organ. This is showing the digestive tract. So in the digestive tract, same thing. We had a layer of epithelium that lines the inside, and then right outside of that, we have smooth muscle. Because when the smooth muscle contracts, now the food can get pushed through the intestines. Then we have, that's all the muscles, so you have to identify those. The last one is going to be pretty easy. This one is just neural tissue. This is neural tissue. And you'll see this picture on your lab exam. Neural tissue is made up of two different types of tissue. We have the neuron, or two different types of cells. We have the neuron. That's just this is what's going to transmit an electrical impulse. So an electrical impulse is going to travel all the way down the axon of that cell. And then we have this up here, which is called the not that. That's also the neuron right there. This is the neuron. Outside of the neuron, we have these other cells that are called neuroglial cells. So this is one example of a neuroglial cell over here, right? And so the neuroglial cells are surrounding the neuron. The neuron's the most important cell. The neuroglial cell is going to maintain it. It maintains and protects it. You'll see this whole picture, and all you'll have to say is neural tissue. That's it, just neural tissue. Okay? So there's a couple of other things in lecture that we're going to go over that will be on the lab exam. Just one other thing, basically, and that's the glandular epithelium that secrete. But we'll talk about all these other things more in depth in lecture, except for all of that epithelium. I covered that pretty clearly in the beginning. That's all you'll get for epithelium.